In the night of the 8th ninth, the emperor, seeming to have decided to make peace, the night was spent in preparing the dispatches, and at 8 o'clock in the morning of the ninth, they were brought to him to sign, but he had changed his mind. At 7 o'clock, he had received news of the Russian and Prussian armies. When the Duc de Bassano entered with the dispatches in his hand, the emperor was lying on his maps and planting his pins. "Ah, it is you," he said to the minister. "There is no more question of that. See here, I would have threshed Blucher. He has taken the Montmirail road. I am going to start. I shall fight him tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. The face of affairs is about to change. We shall see. We won't precipitate anything. There will always be time enough to conclude such a peace as they propose to us." An hour later, we were on the Cézanne road. Then there were several days in succession during which the heroic efforts of the emperor and his brave soldiers were crowned with the most brilliant success. Hardly had they arrived at Champ-Aubert when the army, finding itself in the presence of the Russian army corps, with which it had already combated at Brienne, fell upon it without waiting to repose, separated it from the Prussian army, and made prisoners of the general-in-chief and several general officers. His Majesty, whose behavior towards his vanquished foes was always honorable and generous, had them dine at his table and treated them with the greatest courtesy. The enemies were again beaten at Ferme de Fresneau by Marshals Ney and Mortier, and by the Duc de Ragusa at Vauchamp, where Blucher was again on the point of being made prisoner. At Nancy, the emperor dispersed 150,000 men commanded by Prince Schwarzenberg and dispatched in pursuit of them Marshals Oudinot, Kellerman, MacDonald, and Generals Trailhart and Girard. The eve of the Battle of Memoirs, the emperor went through all the environs of that little city, and his observing eye rested upon an immense extent of marsh, in the midst of which is the village of Batignoux, and a little further away the town of Anglure, where flows the Aube. After the rapid excursion he made over the moving ground of these dangerous marshes, he dismounted and sat down upon a bundle of reeds. There, with his back resting against the hut of a night watchman, he unrolled his campaign map. After examining it for some moments, he mounted his horse and set off at a gallop. At this moment, a cloud of teal and snipe flying in front of his Majesty, he cried with a laugh, go on, my beauties. Give place to other game." To all who surrounded him, his Majesty said, "This time we've got them." The emperor was galloping toward Anglure to see whether the rising ground of Baudemont, which is near that town, were occupied by the artillery, when the noise of a cannon on the Maurice side obliged him to retrace his steps. He turned therefore towards Maurice, saying to the officers who followed him, "Gallop, gentlemen, our enemies are in a hurry. It won't do to keep them waiting." Half an hour later he was on the field of battle. The flames of the conflagration of Marie drove back enormous clouds of smoke upon the Russian and Prussian columns, and disguised in part the maneuvers of the French army. At that moment, everything announced the success of the plan the emperor had conceived that morning in the marshes of Batignoux. All was going well. His Majesty saw the Allies defeated and France saved, while at Anglure everything was in desolation. The population of several villages were dreading to see the enemy approach, with not a piece of cannon there to cut off their retreat, not a soldier to prevent them from crossing the river. The position of the Allies was so critical that the whole French army believed them to be lost. They plunged with all their artillery into the marshes, and, riddled with grape shot from our cannons, they should have stayed there. All of a sudden they were seen to make another effort, range themselves in order of battle, and prepare to cross the Elbe. The emperor, who could pursue them no longer without exposing his army also to the danger of sinking in the marshes, arrested the impetuosity of his soldiers, believing that the hill of Baudemont was covered with artillery which would crush the enemy. Not hearing a single discharge from that quarter, he went with all speed to Cézanne to hasten the troops forward. But those whom he expected to find there had been sent on to fair Champenoise. During this interval, a property owner at Anglure named Ausseur had mounted a horse and galloped to Cézanne to warn the marshal who was there that the enemy pursued by the emperor was about to cross the Elbe. On arriving near the Duke, and seeing that the army corps he commanded was not taking the road to Anglure, he made haste to speak. But as he seemed to have received no orders from the emperor, he was not listened to. He was treated as a spy, and it was only with difficulty that this brave man avoided being shot. While this scene was taking place, His Majesty, already at Cezanne, being surrounded by several of the villagers, asked for someone to guide him to Fair Champenoise. A bailiff presented himself. The emperor set off at once, escorted by some superior officers who had accompanied him to Cezanne. He said to his guide, "Go in front of me, sir, and take the shortest road." On arriving within a short distance of the battlefield of Fair Champenoise, His Majesty saw that each detonation of artillery made the poor bailiff lower his head. "You are afraid, sir?" said the emperor. "No, sire." "In that case, why do you lower your head like that?" "Because I am not accustomed, like your Majesty, to hear all this uproar." "We have to get used to everything. Don't be afraid. Keep straight on." But the guide, more dead than alive, drew in his horse and trembled in every limb. "Come, come, I see you are really afraid. Get behind me." He obeyed, turned rein, and galloped back to Cezanne, promising himself never again to act as the emperor's guide on a similar occasion. At the Battle of Marie, the emperor threw a little bridge across a river which flows near the town under the enemy's fire. This bridge was constructed in an hour with ladders fastened together and supported by pieces of wood, but this was not sufficient to make it practicable. It was necessary to lay planks across it, and none were to be found, for the persons who might have procured some dared not approach the shot-riddled ground the emperor was occupying at that moment. Impatient and even angry at not being able to board over the bridge, His Majesty had the shutters of several large houses near the river taken down and then laid and nailed fast under his own eyes. While this work was going on, an extreme thirst tormented him, and he was going to dip up water in his hand to quench it, when a young girl who had despised danger in order to approach the emperor ran to a neighboring house and brought him a glass of wine and water, which he drank with avidity. Astonished to see this young girl in so dangerous a place, the emperor smilingly said to her, "You would make a brave soldier, mademoiselle. Will you take the epaulettes? You shall be one of my aides de camp." The young girl blushed courtesy to the emperor and was about to go away when he held out his hand, which she kissed. "Come to Paris after this," added His Majesty, "and remind me of the service you have rendered me today. You will be contented with my gratitude." The young person thanked the emperor and withdrew, very proud of the words he had addressed to her. On the day the Battle of Nangis was fought, an Austrian officer came in the evening to headquarters and had a long secret interview with His Majesty. 48 hours later, after the Battle of Marie, a new envoy from Prince Schwarzenberg appeared with a response from the Emperor of Austria to the confidential letter which His Majesty had written to his father-in-law 2 days before. We had quitted Marie, which was on fire, and in the little hamlet of Chartres, where the headquarters were established. No shelter was found for His Majesty but in the shop of a wheelwright. It was there the emperor spent the night, either waking or lying in his clothes on the bed without sleeping. There also he received the Austrian envoy, Prince Liechtenstein. The prince remained a long time in private with His Majesty. Nothing transpired of their conversation, but no one doubted that it was concerning peace. After his departure, the emperor displayed an extraordinary gaiety, which communicated itself to all around him. Our army had made thousands of prisoners from the enemy. Paris had just received the Russian and Prussian flags taken at Nangis and Montereau. The emperor had seen flying before him the foreign sovereigns who were for some time in dread lest they should not regain the frontier. Such success had restored all His Majesty's confidence in his fortune. But this confidence was unhappily but a dangerous illusion. Prince Liechtenstein had barely left headquarters when I saw Monsieur de Saint-Aignan arrive, the brother-in-law of the Duc de Vicenza, an equerry of the emperor. Monsieur de Saint-Aignan, I think, was coming to his brother-in-law, who was at the Congress of Châtillon, or rather who had been there, for the session of this Congress had been suspended for some days. It seems that before leaving Paris, Monsieur de Saint-Aignan had an interview with the Duc de Rovigo and another minister, and that they had entrusted him with a verbal message to the emperor. The mission was difficult and delicate. He was anxious to have these gentlemen put into writing the representations they charged him to convey to His Majesty, but they had refused, and as loyal servitor, Monsieur de Saint-Aignan had devoted himself to his duty and was ready to say the whole truth, no matter what danger there might be in doing so. At the moment when he arrived at the shop of the Chartres wheelwright, The emperor, as has just been seen, was giving full rein to his most brilliant hopes. This was an unlucky circumstance for Monsieur de Saint-Aignan, who was not the bearer of agreeable tidings. He came, as was afterwards learned, to announce to his majesty that he could not rely on the temper of the capital, that people there were complaining of the duration of the war, and that they would like the emperor to seize the first occasion to make peace. It has even been said that the word disaffection had issued during the secret conference from the sincere and truthful mouth of Monsieur de Saint-Aignan. I do not know whether that is true, for the door was shut closed, and Monsieur de Saint-Aignan spoke in a low tone. It is certain, however, that his reports on his frankness excited to the utmost pitch the anger of his majesty, who, in dismissing him with a harshness which he certainly had not deserved, raised his voice high enough to be heard by the gods. Monsieur de Saint-Aignan, having withdrawn, his majesty summoned me to my duties, and I found him still pale and disturbed by anger. Some hours after this scene, the emperor, having demanded his horse, Monsieur de Saint-Aignan, who had resumed his duties as equerry, came up to hold his majesty's stirrup. But as soon as the emperor perceived him, he frowned, motioned him away, and shouted, Miss Grigny, in a loud voice. He was calling Baron de Miss Grigny his other equerry. In conformity with the emperor's wishes, Monsieur de Miss Grigny took the service of Monsieur de Saint-Aignan, who went to the rear of the army to wait until the storm should pass. Within a few days, his disgrace ended, and all who knew him were rejoiced. Baron de Saint-Aignan was loved by everyone for his amiability and loyalty. From Chartres to the emperor marched on Troy. The enemies were occupying the city and seemed at first inclined to defend it, but they soon surrendered and left it after capitulation. During this short time the Allies had been at Troy, the Royalists had publicly displayed their hatred against the emperor and their devotion to the foreign powers, who said they were coming merely to replace the Bourbons on their throne. They had even been so imprudent as to raise the white flag and wear the white cockade. The foreign troops had protected them, although they were exacting and severe to those of the inhabitants, who held a directly contrary opinion. Unluckily for the Royalists, they were in a very slender minority, and the favor with which they were regarded by the Prussians and Russians made the population, crushed by the latter, hate the protected as much as the protectors. Already before the emperor entered Troy, royalist proclamations addressed to the officers of his household or of the army had fallen into his hands. He had shown no sign of anger, but he had pledged those who had received or were receiving documents of this kind to destroy them and say not a word to anyone. On arriving at Troy, His Majesty issued a decree inflicting a penalty of death on Frenchmen in the service of the enemies and on those who had worn the signs and decorations of the former dynasty. And a fortunate emigre brought before a council of war was convicted of having worn the cross of St. Louis and the white cockade during the sojourn of the Allies at Troy, and of having given the foreign generals all the information that he could. The council sentenced him to death, for the facts were positive and the law not less so, a victim of his premature devotion to a cause which was then far from appearing national. Above all, in the departments occupied by the foreign armies, the Chevalier Gonod was, in fact, executed. Chapter 18. After the brilliant advantages gained by the emperor within so short a space of time and with forces so extraordinarily inferior to the masses of the enemy, His Majesty, feeling the necessity of allowing his troops for a few days' rest at Troy, had entered into arrangements for an armistice with Prince Schwarzenberg. Under the circumstances, the emperor was informed that General Blücher, who had been wounded at Memoirs, was descending both banks of the Marne at the head of an army of fresh troops estimated at not less than 100,000 men, and marching towards Meaux. Prince Schwarzenberg, on his side, having been told of this movement of Blücher, cut the negotiations short and immediately resumed the offensive at Bar-sur-Seine. The emperor, whose genius comprehended within a single glass all the marches, all the operations of the enemy, but who could not be everywhere at once, resolved to go and fight Blücher in person, and yet by means of a stratagem to make it believed that he was confronting Schwarzenberg. Two army corps, therefore, one commanded by Marshal Oudinot and the other by Marshal MacDonald, were sent to meet the Austrians. As soon as the troops were within range of the hostile camp, they made the air ring with those shouts of confidence and joy, which usually announced the presence of the Emperor. Meantime, we were hurrying to meet Blucher with all possible speed. We came to a halt at the little village of Herbisse, where we went to spend the night in a presbytery. The curé, on seeing the emperor arrive at his house with his marshals, aides-de-camp, orderly officers, the service of honor, and other attendants, was for a moment almost dazed. His Majesty, as he dismounted, said to him, "Monsieur le curé, we have come to ask your hospitality for one night. Don't let this visit alarm you. We will make ourselves very small so as not to crowd you." The emperor, conducted by the good curé, who was perspiring with mingled eagerness and embarrassment, established himself in the only apartment which served our host as kitchen, dining room, bedchamber, study, and parlor. In an instant, His Majesty was surrounded by his maps and papers and had to work as comfortably as in his cabinet at the Tuileries. But the members of his suite needed a little more time to install themselves. It was not an easy matter for so many people to find room in a bakehouse, which, with the chamber occupied by His Majesty, comprised all that there was of the presbytery of Herbisse. But these gentlemen, although there was more than one dignitary and prince of the empire among them, were accommodating and quite inclined to make the best of matters. It was a remarkable thing and very indicative of French character to see the good humor of these brave warriors in spite of the daily combats they had to sustain and of events which at every instant took a more alarming turn. The younger officers formed a circle around the niece of the curé, who sang them with some provincial hymns. The good curé, amidst this continual goings and comings and the pains he was taking to play worthily his part as host, was attacked on his own ground, that is to say, on his breviary, by Marshal Lefebvre, who had made some studies for the priesthood in his youth and who said he had retained nothing from his first vocation but the coiffure, because it was the soonest combed. The worthy marshal interlarded his Latin quotations with military expressions, of which he was by no means sparing, and he made all present roar with laughter, including the curé, who said to him, "Monseigneur, if you had continued your studies for the priesthood, you would have become a cardinal at least." "Why not?" observed one of the officers. "If the Abbé Maury had been a sergeant major in '89, he might possibly be a marshal of France today, or else dead," added the Duc de Danzig, but employing a much more energetic word. "And so much the better for him. He would not see the Cossacks within 20 leagues of Paris." "Oh, bah, monseigneur," returned the same officer. "We shall chase them back." "Yes," muttered the marshal between his teeth. "We shall see if they come." At this moment arrived the canteen mule, long and patiently expected. There was no table, but one was made by laying a door across some casks. Seats were improvised with boards. The principal officer sat down. The officers ate standing. The curé took his place at the military table, on which he had himself set the best bottles from his cellar, and his good-natured simplicity continued to enliven the guests. The conversation happened to turn on the situation of Herbisse and the neighborhood. The curé could not recover from his astonishment on finding that his guests knew the region, even in the least details. "Ah," said he, looking at them, one after another, "so you are all Champagne men?" To put an end to his surprise, these gentlemen drew plans from their pockets, in which they showed him the names of the small localities. But then his amazement merely changed its object. He had never imagined that military science required such exact studies. What labors, he repeated, what exertions! And all that to fire cannonballs! The supper ended. The next thing was how to sleep, and as shelter some straw was found in neighboring barns. Nobody remained outside and near the door of the chamber occupied by the emperor, but the officers on duty, Rustem and me. Each had his bundle of hay for a bed. Our worthy host, having relinquished his own bed to His Majesty, stayed with us and rested as we did from his fatigues of the day. He was yet in his first sleep when the headquarters left the presbytery. The emperor rose and departed before daybreak. The curé, on awakening, manifested much chagrin at not having been able to bid his majesty adieu. He was handed a purse containing the sum which the emperor, when he stopped at the houses of private persons not greatly favored by fortune, was accustomed to leave behind him as an indemnity for their expenses and trouble, and we resumed our march after the emperor, who was hastening to meet the Prussians. The emperor wished to arrive at Soissons before the Allies, but although they had to traverse difficult roads, they were in advance of our troops. And on entering Ferté, the emperor saw them retire upon Soissons. He was delighted to see it. Soissons was defended by a good garrison, and might delay the enemy, while Marshals Marmont and Mornay and His Majesty in person attacking Blucher on the rear, and the two flanks would shut them up in a trap. But again the enemy escaped the combinations of the emperor just when he expected to seize him. Hardly had Blucher presented himself before Soissons when the gates were opened to him. General Moreau, commandant of the place, had already delivered the city to Bülow, and thus assured to the Allies the passage of the Aisne. On receiving this discouraging news, the emperor exclaimed, "The name of Moreau has always been fatal to me." Continuing, nevertheless, his pursuit of the Prussians, His Majesty occupied himself with preventing the passage of the Aisne. March 5, he sent General Nansouty forward, who, with his cavalry, tore up the bridge, repulsed the enemy, and made a Russian colonel prisoner. After passing the night at Berry-au-Bac, the emperor was marching on Laon when someone informed him that the enemy was coming to meet us. It was not the Prussians, but a Russian army corps, commanded by Second. On advancing, we found the Russians established on the heights of Crayon and covering the Laon road. Their position seemed unassailable. Nevertheless, our vanguard, led by Marshal Ney, rushed forward and succeeded in occupying Crayon. It was enough for that day, and the night was spent on both sides in preparing for the morrow's battle. The emperor passed the night in the village of Corbigny, but without going to bed. Inhabitants from the neighboring villages were arriving every hour with information concerning the position of the enemy and the lay of the ground. His Majesty interrogated them himself, praised or even rewarded them for their zeal, and availed himself at their services and their knowledge. Thus, for example, having recognized in the mayor of a commune in the environs of Crayon one of his former comrades in the regiment of La Fère, he made him one of his aides-de-camp and utilized him as a guide over this ground, which no one knew better than he. Monsieur de Bussy, which was the name of this officer, had left France during the Terror, and since his return had never resumed service, but lived in retirement on his estates. The emperor met still another of his former companions in arms of the La Fère regiment that night. This was an Alsatian named Wolfe, who had been an artillery sergeant with the emperor and Monsieur de Bussy as his superiors. He came from Strasbourg and testified to the good disposition of the inhabitants in all the departments he had passed through. The shock given to the Allied armies by the first attacks of the emperor had been felt as far as the frontiers, and on all the roads the peasants had risen in arms, cut off the retreat, and killed a great many of the enemy. Partisan corps had been formed in the Vosges, led by officers of tried courage and accustomed to this style of warfare. The garrison of the cities and strongholds of the east were full of courage and determination, and it would not be by their goodwill if France did not become, according to the wish expressed by the emperor, the grave of the foreign armies. The brave Wolfe, after having given this information to His Majesty, repeated it in the presence of many other persons, of whom I was one. He only stayed a few hours to rest himself and then departed. But the emperor did not dismiss him until he had decorated him with the Cross of Honor in recompense of his devotion. The battle of Crayon began again at daybreak on the 7th. The infantry was commanded by Prince de la Moskowa and the Duc de Bellune, who was wounded on that day. Generals Grouchy and Nansouty, the first commanding the army cavalry, and the second, the cavalry, the guard, also received serious wounds. The difficulty was to hold the heights, not to ascend them. Nevertheless, the French artillery directed by the modest and skillful General Drouot, forced that of the enemy to cede the ground little by little, but it was a horribly bloody struggle. The two sides of this hill were too craggy to admit of the Russians being attacked in the flank, so that their retreat was slow and murderous. They recoiled nevertheless and abandoned the field of battle. 2 our troops pursued as far as the Angel Guardian Tavern. They wheeled and kept up the fight for some hours longer in that locality. The emperor, who in this battle, as in all others of the campaign, had fought bravely and incurred as many dangers as the most exposed soldier, transferred his imperial quarters to the hamlet of Bray. Hardly had he entered the chamber which served as his cabinet when he called me, took his boots off while leaning on my shoulder, but without saying a word, threw his sword and hat on the table and stretched himself on his bed with a profound sigh, or rather with one of those exclamations of which one cannot say whether they are caused by discouragement or merely by fatigue. His Majesty's countenance was sorrowful and anxious. Nevertheless, he slept the sleep of lassitude for several hours. I awakened him to announce the arrival of Monsieur de Rumigny, who brought dispatches from Châtillon. In the existing disposition of the emperor's mind, he seemed ready to accept all reasonable conditions which should be offered to him. All reasonable conditions. Hence, I avow that I had hopes, and many another beside me, that at last we were on the point of obtaining the peace so ardently desired. The emperor received Monsieur de Rumigny without witnesses, and the tete-a-tete lasted a long while. Nothing transpired of what was said, and it would seem to me that nothing good was to be inferred from this mystery. Very early the next morning, Monsieur de Rumigny set off again for Châtillon, where the Duc de Vicenza was waiting him, and from some words spoken by His Majesty, as he was mounting his horse to go out to the outposts, it was easy to see that he had not yet been able to resign himself to the idea of making peace, which he regarded as dishonor. While the Duc de Vicenza was at Châtillon or Lusigny to treat of peace, the emperor's orders required him to delay or to press the conclusion of the treaty according to his successes or his disadvantages. At every gleam of hope, he demanded more than they were willing to grant, and in this he imitated the example given him by the sovereign allies, whose requirements ever since the armistice of Dresden had gone on increasing as they came nearer France. When at last all was broken off, the Duc de Vicenza rejoined His Majesty at Saint-Dizier. I was in a little salon so close to the sleeping chamber that I could not avoid overhearing their conversation, as the Duc de Vicenza was continually returning to the charge and combating the emperor's aversion to a positive decision. His Majesty exclaimed with great vehemence, "You are a Russian, Caulaincourt!" "No, sire," the Duke responded quickly. "No, I am a Frenchman. I think I prove it by urging your Majesty to make peace." The discussion was kept up with warmth in terms which, unfortunately, I cannot recall. What I know well is that every time that the Duc de Vicenza insisted and tried to make His Majesty appreciate the reasons which to him seemed to make peace indispensable, the Emperor replied, "If I gain a battle, as I am sure to do, I shall be master and can exact better conditions. The tomb of the Russians is marked out under the walls of Paris. My measures are all taken, and victory cannot fail me." After this interview, which lasted more than an hour, in which the Duc de Vicenza could obtain nothing, I saw him leave the chamber of His Majesty. He rapidly crossed the salon in which I was. Nevertheless, I had time enough to notice that his face was extremely animated, and that, yielding to his deep emotion, great tears were falling from his eyes. Doubtless he had been acutely wounded by what the Emperor had said of his fondness for the Russians. However that might be, I never saw the Duc de Vicenza again until at Fontainebleau. Meanwhile, the Emperor marched with the vanguard and wished to reach Lyon by the evening of the 8th, but to gain that city it was necessary to pass over marshy grounds by means of a narrow embankment. The enemy held this road and opposed our passage. After several discharges of cannon had been exchanged, the Emperor put off until the next day the attack to force the passage, and came back, not to go to bed, for at this critical time he seldom went to bed, but to pass the night in the hamlet of Chavignon. In the middle of that night, General Flahaut came to announce to the Emperor that the commissioners of Allied powers had just broken off the conference at Lusigny. The army was not informed of this, although the news would probably have surprised nobody. Before day, General Gourgaud set off at the head of a troop picked from among the bravest soldiers of the army and followed a crossroad to the left in the middle of the marshes, fell unexpectedly upon the enemy, killed many of them under favor of the darkness, and drew the attention of the Allied generals in his direction, while Marshal Ney, still at the head of the vanguard, took advantage of this audacious maneuver to force the passage of the embankment. The whole army hastened to follow his movement, and in the evening of the 9th it was in sight of Lyon and in battle array before the enemy, who occupied the city and the heights. The army corps of the Duc de Ragusa had arrived by another road and was also in line before the Russian and Prussian army. His Majesty passed the night in expediting his orders and preparing everything for the grand attack, which was to take place at daybreak the next morning. The appointed hour having arrived, I hastily completed the Emperor's short toilet, and he had already put foot in the stirrups when some cavaliers belonging to the army corps of the Duc de Ragusa were seen running up on foot and breathless. His Majesty had them brought before him and demanded in an angry tone the cause of this disorder. They said that their bivouacs had been unexpectedly attacked by the enemy, that they and their comrades had offered every possible resistance to overwhelming forces, although they had barely time enough to seize their weapons, but that they had at last been obliged to give way to numbers, and that it was only by a miracle that they had escaped the massacre. Yes, replied the Emperor, contracting his eyebrows. By a miracle of agility, we shall see about that presently. What has become of the Marshal? One of the soldiers said that he had seen the Duc de Ragusa fall dead, another that he had been made prisoner. His Majesty sent his aides de camp and orderly officers to reconnoiter, and the report of the cavaliers turned out to be only too true. The enemy had not waited to be attacked. It had fallen on the army corps of the Duc de Ragusa, surrounded it, and taken part of its artillery. The Marshal, however, had neither been wounded nor taken prisoner. He was on the road to Reims, trying to arrest and bring back the remnant of his army corps. The news of this disaster still further increased the chagrin of His Majesty. However, the enemy was beaten back as far as the gates of Lyon, but the retaking of the city had become impossible after several fruitless attempts, or rather after several feigned attacks, the object of which was to conceal his retreat from the enemy. The Emperor came back to Chavignon, where we passed the night. The next day, the 11th, we quitted this village and fell back on Soissons. His Majesty dismounted at the bishop's house and at once summoned Marshal Mortier and the principal officers of the place to consider with them the means of putting the city in a state of defense. For 2 days the Emperor shut himself up to work in his cabinet, never leaving it but to go and examine the ground, visit the fortifications, give his orders everywhere, and superintend their execution. Amidst these preparations for defense, His Majesty learned that the city of Reims had been taken by the Prussian general Saint Priest. In spite of the vigorous resistance of General Corbineau, whose fate was unknown, but who was believed to be dead or fallen into the hands of the Russians, His Majesty confided the defense of Soissons to the Marshal Duc de Trevisa and went himself towards Reims by forced marches. We arrived that very evening at the gates of the city. The Russians were not expecting His Majesty there. Our soldiers began the battle without having taken any repose and fought with a determination which the presence and example of the Emperor never failed to inspire. The combat lasted all the evening and was even prolonged far into the night, but General Saint Priest, having been grievously wounded, the resistance of his troops began to weaken, and they abandoned the city about 2 o'clock in the morning. The Emperor and his army entered by one gate, while the Russians were departing by another. The inhabitants crowded around His Majesty, who, before descending from the horse, inquired what damage the enemy was supposed to have inflicted. He was told that the city had suffered no damage except what must inevitably result from a sanguinary nocturnal fight, and that for the rest. The hostile general had maintained rigorous discipline among his troops during their stay and up till the moment of his retreat. Among the persons surrounding His Majesty at this time was the brave General Corbineau. He was in citizen's dress and had remained concealed and in disguise in a private house of that city. The next morning he again presented himself before his Majesty, who received him very well and complimented him on the courage he had displayed in circumstances so difficult. The Duc de Ragusa had rejoined the emperor under the walls of Reims, and his army corps had assisted in the taking of the city. When he made his appearance before the emperor, the latter had broken out into sharp and severe reproaches on the subject of the affair at Laon. But his anger was not of long duration. His Majesty soon resumed with the marshal the friendly tone with which he habitually honored him. They had a long conference together, and the Duc de Ragusa stayed to dinner with the emperor. His Majesty spent 3 days at Reims in order to give his troops time to rest and recruit themselves before continuing this rude campaign. They needed it, for old soldiers would have found it hard work to endure continual forced marches that always ended in sanguinary battle. And yet the majority of the heroes who obeyed the orders of the emperor with such indefatigable ardor were conscripts levied in all haste and sent to fight against troops inured to war and the best disciplined in Europe. Most of them had not even time to learn how to drill, and took their first lesson in front of the enemy, brave youth which sacrificed itself without a murmur, and to whom the emperor never but once failed to do justice, in a matter which I have previously described, and in which Monsieur Larry played so fine a role. It is perfectly true, in fact, that the terrible campaign of 1814 was, for the most part, made with new recruits. During the stay of 3 days which we made at Reims, the emperor beheld with a lively joy that he did not try to conceal the arrival of an army corps of 6,000 men, brought to him by the faithful General Janssens. This reinforcement of experienced troops could not have come at a more timely moment, while our soldiers were regaining breath for the renewal of a desperate struggle. His Majesty was applying himself to the most varied tasks with his accustomed ardor. Even amidst the cares and dangers of war, the emperor neglected not a single affair of the empire. Every day he worked for several hours with the Duc de Bassano, received couriers from Paris, dictated his responses, and fatigued his secretaries almost as much as he did his generals and soldiers. As for himself, he remained always indefatigable.